Hi friends, thanks for connecting with me today. I hope that you're doing good. So you probably noticed that over the summer months and even into the fall, our YouTube discussion starter videos have been pretty spotty because of our alpha series. And even last week, I didn't record our discussion because I had a pretty crazy week and just didn't have time for it. But going forward, we'll get back into a better rhythm of releasing these videos on Saturday mornings. And so some people, of course, if you can't be with us, then, some people like to watch them, or some people like to watch them even before we come together on Sunday to help them to process and prepare for our discussion. So either way, I hope that you will benefit from this time. Okay, so last week we started a new series in the book of Philippians, and I'm calling this series Love Letter, because this is a very real and very sincere love letter that Paul wrote to his friends in the city of Philippi. Last week we talked about how we need to read this through the lens of this is a very real person, Paul, the Apostle Paul, Pastor Paul, who's writing to very real people that he has very real admiration and love for. And in the beginning verses, we see love just pouring out of Paul's pen, or even, whatever, as he quotes or dictates the letter. But we can just see love pouring out. In verse 3, Paul says, every time I think of you, I give thanks to my God. And then in verse 7, he says that you have a special place in my heart. And then in the next verse 8, he says that God knows how much I love you, right? So love is just pouring out of Paul's pen as he's writing to his friends in Philippi. And it's helpful to see everything that Paul says here through the lens of love. And we certainly saw that last week, how love changes everything in terms of our discipleship. And this week we're going to see how love changes everything in terms of how we deal with problems. So, in the first few verses of Paul's letter, he just kind of is loving on people, saying how much he loves them, and he has a special little prayer for them. And then Paul turns his attention to report to his friends on his current situation, that he was in prison. And but it's interesting, and we'll see this in just a moment. It's interesting how Paul is reporting that he's in prison, but he's not complaining. He's not feeling bad for himself. He actually has a really beautiful perspective, or whatever, of hope and of joy, even while he's reporting about being in prison. So, before we dive in, let me just kind of set the context here, set the stage for this section of the letter. So let's go back to the very beginning. Before Paul was a follower of Jesus, we know that Paul was very, very opposed to this new Christianity thing, and very opposed to these new Christians. And in fact, he poured a ton of hatred and violence towards these Christians, and oversaw them being thrown in prison and being kicked out of their homes, and even oversaw them being killed, right? Paul was vehemently opposed and violent towards Christians. And then when Paul became a follower of Jesus himself, that same violence, that same hatred turned on him, and he became the object of people who were doing the same thing. And so we see in 2 Corinthians verse 11, 2 Corinthians chapter 11, that Paul is reporting the hardships that he has gone through in order to be a follower of Jesus. So let's read. Paul, of course, is speaking here, and he says that I have worked harder, been in prison more often, been whipped times without number, have faced death again and again. He says, five different times the Jewish leaders gave me 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. And then down in verse 27, he says, I have worked hard and long, and during many sleepless nights, I've been hungry and thirsty, and have often gone without food. I have shivered in the cold without enough clothing, to keep me warm, right? So Paul just kind of gave us a summary of all of the hardships, all of the problems that he's experienced, particularly because of being a follower of Jesus and because of, telling others about that message. So now we kind of fast forward a little bit to this period in Paul's life when he is under house arrest in the city of Rome. Okay, he's been charged by the Jewish people, by the religious leaders in Jerusalem, and he's appealed to Caesar, and he's gone to Rome, and he's waiting for his trial. So for a 2-year period, Paul was under house arrest in the city of Rome, and people were able to come to him and bring him food and clothing and money. And in fact, the Philippians, the Christians in the city of Philippi, sent him a gift of money or clothes or food or whatever. And part of this letter was thanking them, for what they sent him. So Paul is under house arrest for 2 years. And but then, as Paul gets closer to his trial, he's been now transferred to prison, to like a dungeon with palace guards, right? So now Paul is getting close to his trial, and in this trial, Paul is going to find out if the Roman emperor will find him guilty and be put to death, or if he'll find him innocent and be set free. Okay, so all of this is now coming down to the moment of truth, the verdict, when Paul will discover, if he lives or dies. So in this time, when he's in prison, he's getting closer to his trial, he writes a letter to his Philippian friends. And Paul says, in verse 12, and I want you to know, my dear brothers and sisters, that everything that has happened to me, like here in prison, everything that has happened to me has helped to spread the good news. For everyone here, including the whole palace guard, knows that I am in chains because of Christ. And because of my imprisonment, most of the believers here have gained confidence and boldly speak God's message without fear. And then skipping down to verse 18, and I will continue to rejoice, for I know that as you pray for me and the Spirit of Jesus Christ helps me, this will lead to my deliverance. In other words, Paul is saying this will lead to my deliverance. He says, I think I'm going to be found innocent. I'm going to be set free. And then verse 20, for I fully expect and hope that I will never be ashamed, but that I will continue to be bold for Christ as I have been in the past. And I trust that my life will bring honor to Christ, whether I live or die. So in other words, regardless of the verdict, guilty, death, innocence, freedom, whether I live or die, for me, verse 21, for me, living means living for Christ. And dying is even better. It's kind of a strange thing to say, right? Death is even better. Dying is even better. But now we can hear this, Paul processing his thoughts out loud. But if I live, I can do more fruitful work for Christ. So I really don't know which is better. I'm torn between the two desires. I long to go to be with Christ, which would be far better for me. But for your sakes, it's better that I continue to live. Knowing this, I'm convinced that I will remain alive so I can continue to help all of you grow and experience the joy of your faith. Okay, so it's so interesting here that we see Paul, again, he knows that he's coming closer to the trial. He knows the moment of truth is coming, or not necessarily truth, but he's coming closer to the verdict. And will I live? Will I die? And he's kind of thinking out loud about weighing those two options. And let me just kind of pause for just a moment and give you the end of the story. Paul, and by the way, this corresponds to the end of the book of Acts. In Acts 28, verses 30 and 31, refers to Paul's imprisonment in Rome. And so at the end of the book of Acts, the book ends without telling us the rest of the story. And then that's part of the writer's, I don't know, just there's more to come kind of thing. But anyways, so we're not told the end of the story, but let me tell you what happens. So Paul, however long after writing the letter, he actually does go to trial, and the Roman emperor found him innocent, and he was released. And he went on again. Actually, he went back to Philippi for another visit, and he went on to visit, many different cities and continue to spread the good news about Jesus. But then there aren't very clear documentation about this part of the story, but it seems that about 4 years after Paul was set free in this Roman, at this time, about 4 years later, he was put in prison again, and this time he was found guilty and he was executed, beheaded, in Rome by the Emperor Nero, who was kind of a crazy person and who really hated Christians. So that's kind of the end of the story. Paul was released. He had 4 more years of freedom, 4 more years of life, and then he was beheaded by Nero in, I think it's 67 AD or something like that. Okay, so here's what I wanted to talk about today, and this is what our discussion will center around. And our discussion will center around the problem of pain and suffering, right? Friends, here's one thing that I know, that life happens, right? Life is life, and nobody is immune from suffering. Not even a great man of God like Paul. Nobody is immune from suffering. We all face physical suffering, illness, or emotional suffering from our own internal stuff, fear, anxiety, or relationship problems. We all face suffering. Nobody is immune from it. And friends, we humans, it seems like we spend our entire life trying to avoid suffering, right? We take vitamins, we exercise to stay healthy so we don't get sick. We try to avoid suffering, right? But suffering happens to all of us. And here's something else that I've observed, that when suffering happens, we spend our whole life trying to avoid suffering, but when suffering finally catches up to us and punches us in the nose, our human nature causes us to go inside and to feel bad for ourselves, and if we give into it, to have a pity party, right? When we're hit by suffering, our human nature causes us to go inside, to feel bad, for ourselves. But that only leads, having a pity party only leads to feeling worse about the situation, right? It only leads to increased suffering when we go inside and we have a pity party. And this might seem counterintuitive, and it certainly is countercultural, but Paul gives us a better way. Paul shows us a better way here in Philippians chapter 1, that instead of going inside and feeling bad for myself, Paul turned his attention outwards. When he was hit with suffering, he turned his attention outwards to other people, to the Philippian people. We'll show you that in a second. And he also turned his attention outwards to something larger than himself, and that is the gospel of Jesus Christ. So Paul resisted the urge to go inside, and he looked outwards. So let me just show you a couple examples. Paul focused on other people when his human nature probably would have pushed him to, think about himself. Again, in verses 23 and 24, he said, "I'm torn between 2 desires. I long to go and be with Christ, which would be far better for me. But listen, but for your sakes, it's better that I continue to live," right? it would have been, it seems weird and it sounds weird for Paul to say, yeah, I actually kind of prefer door A to go home to die. I prefer to die, to go home to be with the Lord in heaven. But he said, but I resist that and I choose you. I want to stay and maybe suffer longer so that I can continue to help you, to serve you. And this speaks to me about putting your needs before my own. It's my needs versus your needs. And putting the needs of others before my own needs actually leads, again, it's counterintuitive, countercultural, but it actually leads to my happiness when I put your needs first, right? And it's a weird thing, but it just works. So first of all, Paul shows us that, by resisting the need to look inside and try to, lick my own wounds kind of thing, that I put the needs of others first. But Paul also, I see that he focused on something bigger than himself, in that he focused on Jesus and the message of the good news of Jesus. In verse 12, he says, he's reporting about being in prison, and he says that everything that has happened to me here has actually been a good thing. It's actually helped to spread the good news about Jesus, right? So again, Paul's not like, oh, poor me, I'm in prison. No, he's like, hey, actually, this is amazing. This has actually helped it, to spread the good news. So friends, we're going to have a conversation on Sunday about when suffering punches us in the nose. Our human nature wants us to turn inside, but what can we learn from Paul? How can we actually focus on others, and how can we benefit from that? We'll have a conversation around that on Sunday. So I think it will be, it'll be an interesting conversation. There's so much that we can learn from this, but I could say more. I have more in my notes here, but I won't. We'll save it for Sunday. Okay, so thank you so much for connecting with me, and I look forward to being with you on Sunday. God bless you, friends.